Margaret Caldwell walked onto the airplane bridge like she was the most important person in the world. Her high heels made a loud click, click, click on the floor, like she expected everything and everyone to move out of her way. Behind her, she pulled a fancy suitcase, one that matched her expensive coat. Everything about her screamed rich and important. She didn't need to look around to know that people were watching her. People always watched her. That's how it had been her whole life. She walked like someone who never had to wait in a long line, someone who always got what she wanted. As she stepped into the first-class section of the plane, she took a deep breath. It smelled exactly how she liked it. Soft, fancy leather seats, fresh citrusy hand sanitizer, and the bubbly scent of champagne. This was her world. A place for important people who made a lot of money. A place where the coffee was always hot, the seats leaned back just right, and, most importantly, where you didn't have to sit next to just anybody. She had taken this flight from Dallas to Washington so many times that she knew exactly where her seat would be. She always sat in the same area, the same row. It was her seat. It was always perfect. But then her steps slowed. Her eyes narrowed. Someone was already sitting in her row. In her space. She froze for a moment, just staring at him. He wore a plain brown hoodie, a simple gray t-shirt, and old jeans with sneakers. He wasn't wearing a suit. He wasn't checking emails on a fancy laptop. He wasn't wearing a big gold watch. No expensive briefcase. He wasn't talking loudly about business or looking around like he was someone important. Instead, he was just sitting there reading a book. He looked too comfortable, too relaxed, like he belonged there. But Margaret knew better. First class was not for people like him. Her eyebrows came together in a tight little frown. The man looked up from his book for a second and gave her a small polite nod and a tiny smile before looking back down. Margaret gave a thin, fake smile back, but inside she was already angry. She shoved her bag into the overhead bin a little too hard before sitting down next to him. She straightened her coat, flicking it out just a little, like she was trying to take back her space. First class was not supposed to feel this casual. She looked at him again out of the corner of her eye. He wasn't doing anything that first-class people usually did. He wasn't making business calls or ordering fancy drinks. He wasn't even trying to act like he belonged. He was just reading his book. Quiet. Come. That bothered her. Margaret shifted in her seat, moving loudly to get his attention. Nothing. She moved again. A little louder this time. Still nothing. The way he was just sitting there, ignoring her, made her feel invisible. And Margaret Caldwell did not like feeling invisible. She stared straight ahead, pressing her lips together in a tight line. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and already, this flight was not going the way she wanted. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves turned to another page of his book, still completely calm. He had noticed Margaret's attitude the moment she walked into the row. He had heard the loud thump of her bag. He had felt her sneaky little glances. He could tell she was annoyed. But Keanu was used to people like Margaret. He had met people like her before. People who thought they were better than others. People who tried to make others feel small without actually saying anything. It didn't bother him. It never had. Keanu had chosen to dress this way for the flight. He wasn't trying to show off. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He just wanted to be comfortable. Margaret, on the other hand, was dressed perfectly. Her nails shiny and perfect, her scarf smelling like expensive perfume. Everything about her screamed rich. But right now she was annoyed. And she didn't know why. She didn't know who Keanu was. And because he didn't look rich, because he wasn't wearing fancy clothes, because he wasn't acting the way she thought important people should act, she had decided he didn't belong. She sighed loudly, hoping he would notice. Keanu looked up, his face calm and steady. Their eyes met for just a moment. Margaret tilted her head and gave a small fake laugh. First class isn't what it used to be, is it? Keanu blinked once and smiled slightly. Comfort still good. People just changed. Margaret chuckled, but not in a nice way. Clearly. Keanu just went back to reading his book. The conversation was over for him. But not for Margaret. Something about the way he just sat there, not caring what she thought, made her even more irritated. She leaned toward him, lowering her voice just enough to sound polite. You know, they used to be a lot more selective about who they let up here. Keanu didn't even flinch. He just raised an eyebrow but didn't respond. Margaret smirked. She felt like she had won something. Back when flying meant class, not just cash. This time, Keanu put his book down and looked right at her. His voice was calm. Maybe class isn't about where you sit. Margaret's smirk disappeared. She sat back in her seat, crossing her arms tightly. She tapped her fingernails against the leather seat, staring straight ahead. It wasn't him that bothered her, she told herself. No, It was the fact that flying first class just wasn't as special as it used to be. At least that's what she wanted to believe. She still didn't know who he was. But she did know one thing: he didn't belong here. And if he wasn't going to move, she would make sure someone else moved him. Because Margaret Caldwell did not share her space. She reached up and pressed the silver call button with one finger. A polite little ding sounded overhead. Margaret sat back in her seat, smiling to herself. If Keanu wasn't going to move, then she would just let the flight attendant handle it. A few moments later, a young blonde flight attendant arrived, smiling politely. "Yes, ma'am? Can I help you?" Margaret smiled sweetly, her voice smooth like honey. "I think there might have been a little mistake. I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Keanu didn't even look up. He turned another page in his book, slow and calm. The flight attendant pulled out her tablet and checked the seating list. She looked up, smiling kindly. "Actually, ma'am, he's right where he's supposed to be. You're in seat 2A. He's in seat 2B. Margaret's face went blank. She blinked. Her jaw tightened just a little. She let out a small, fake laugh. "Well, I just assumed." She let the words dangle in the air, hoping the flight attendant would understand what she was trying to say without her having to actually say it. But the flight attendant only smiled, waiting. Keanu? He just kept reading his book. Still calm. Still unfazed. And Margaret Caldwell? For the first time in a long time, she had nothing to say. "If you need anything else," the flight attendant said, nodding toward Keanu before walking away. Margaret turned toward the window, but her back stayed straight, and her lips pressed together, like she was holding something inside that might be dangerous if she let it out. Still, Keanu didn't say a word. The quiet between them wasn't normal. It wasn't calm. It was the kind of silence that felt louder than shouting. It made Margaret feel small, which she hated. Keanu's quietness wasn't because he was shy. No, it was something stronger. It was like he didn't need to argue with her because he had nothing to prove. That made Margaret even more annoyed. She moved in her seat, making sure her purse brushed against the armrest between them. Keanu didn't react. She let out a big breath, hoping he would notice. But still nothing. So, she pulled out a magazine even though she didn't want to read it. She was just pretending, just like she always did. Her fancy clothes, her expensive perfume, the way she acted in public. It was all a performance. But Keanu sat there, relaxed, like this wasn't even her space. Like first class wasn't her world. Her eyes flicked toward him again. His hoodie wasn't even ironed. His hair was a little messy, his face scruffy, but he looked completely comfortable. Margaret quickly looked away. He was acting like he didn't need to prove anything. Like it didn't bother him that she was there, sitting beside him. And that only made Margaret angrier. Because Margaret Caldwell was used to being in control. She was a woman who had spent years making sure the world around her worked exactly the way she liked it. She didn't ask for things, she made sure they happened. She didn't complain, she fixed things to go her way. But this man sitting there so quietly, refusing to react, was ruining everything. So she sat up straight, crossed her legs and stared out the window, watching the clouds float by. But inside, her thoughts were storming like dark clouds before a thunderstorm. She sipped her champagne without really tasting it. The plane's engines hummed beneath her feet, a soft vibration in the cabin. First class was usually quiet, only the sound of glasses clinking, people turning the pages of newspapers, and business conversations whispered between important people. But not in row 2. In row 2, silence was a battle. Earlier, Margaret had tried to change her seat, but it hadn't worked. That annoyed her even more. She hated being told no. She especially hated being told no in front of people. And she really hated being told no by someone like him. Keanu still hadn't spoken. He read his book like nothing had happened. Like she wasn't even there. Like she was just another passenger. That made her furious. Then, as a tall, well-dressed black man walked past them on his way to the restroom, Margaret didn't even think about what she was doing. She leaned slightly toward Keanu, her voice as soft as a whisper, but sharp enough to cut. "First class isn't as special as it used to be, don't you think?" Keanu didn't look up, but Margaret saw it. A tiny pause. Just for a second. And that thrilled her. So she kept going, her voice smooth, sweet, but with something mean hidden inside. "Used to be, you had to belong here. Now they're just handing out warm towels to anyone." Keanu stopped reading. He closed his book. Not with a slam. Not with a snap. Just a soft, quiet click. Margaret smiled. She turned slightly toward him. "Oh, I didn't mean you, of course." But she let her words trail off like smoke. She smiled wider. "You're a bit of a mystery, aren't you, Keanu?" Finally, he looked at her. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't surprised. They were just tired. And somehow that was worse. He studied her the way someone might watch a wasp buzzing around, annoying but not dangerous. Not yet. And then in a low, steady voice he said, "You know, people show you who they really are when they think they're whispering." Margaret blinked. For the first time the air between them changed. The silence felt different. But Margaret refused to feel guilty. She tilted her head and forced a laugh, light and airy, like she was above all of this. "Oh, come on," she said. "I was just making conversation. No need to be so dramatic." Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't even look amused. He picked up his book again, but this time he didn't open it. He just held it in his lap. Margaret sat back, crossing her legs again. But now something felt off. Her throat was dry. Her small victory didn't feel as sweet anymore. Something had shifted. For the first time she felt other people's eyes. Not many. Not openly. But just enough. A quiet ripple was moving through the cabin. But Margaret ignored it. Because in her world, people like her always held the microphone. And people like him? They were supposed to sit quietly. Even when insulted. But what Margaret didn't realize was that the world had changed. And she was about to find out just how much. Keanu Reeves had spent his whole life knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. In Hollywood. In business. Even in grief. He had learned that sometimes silence was the strongest thing of all. That most words weren't worth fighting over. That dignity came from patience. But there were limits. And Margaret Caldwell had just crossed them. She sat beside him now, smug and satisfied, thinking she had won. She thought her words had been clever. She thought he would just sit there and take it. She thought he would stay quiet. She thought she knew exactly who she was. And exactly who he wasn't. Keanu turned his head. Slowly. Deliberately. He looked her right in the face. The quiet around them deepened, like the air itself was listening. And then, in a voice just as steady as before, he said, "Let me make this very clear, ma'am. You can insult me all you want. I've dealt with worse from better." Margaret blinked. The calm steel in his tone surprised her. "But when you start attacking others," Keanu continued, his voice even lower, "people just walking by, living their lives, you stop being petty." He leaned forward just slightly. "You become dangerous." Margaret straightened in her seat. She tried to summon the confidence she always had in rooms like this. "Excuse me," she huffed. "You're lecturing me over a passing comment?" Keanu didn't flinch. "You weren't whispering, Margaret. You were performing. For me. For anyone you thought would agree with you. That's not a passing comment. That's poison. And you wanted to share it." Her name hit her like a slap. He wasn't supposed to know her name. She swallowed hard. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Keanu's eyes didn't waver. "I know a lot more than your name." He didn't explain. He didn't have to. Across the aisle, someone cleared their throat. Soft. Deliberate. Behind them, a phone camera lifted slightly higher. People were watching. People were listening. Keanu leaned back in his seat. His face showed no feelings. His book was still in his lap, but he hadn't opened it. "You don't have to like me," he finally said. "You don't have to talk to me. But if you're going to sit in silence, at least don't use it to throw words at me like hidden bullets." For the first time, Margaret felt the air around her turn cold, not outside but right where she sat. In her seat, in her skin. She crossed her arms, tightened her jaw, and stayed quiet. There was nothing left to say. And for the first time in years, Margaret Caldwell, the woman who always had the last word, sat speechless. The quiet after Keanu's words wasn't calm. It was heavy, sharp, like a storm waiting to break. Margaret sat frozen, her throat tight, her cheeks hot. She could feel people looking at her. Not many, not openly, but enough. Enough to know she wasn't invisible anymore. And not in a way she liked. She hated this feeling. Her mind raced. She needed to fix this. To take back control. To make sure she was still the most important person in the room. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was Margaret Caldwell. She made people listen. She made problems go away with a single call, a single name. And now some man in a hoodie had made her look small. Had turned her into the center of attention, and not in a good way. She took a deep breath, sat up straighter, and turned to Keanu. Her voice was sharp, polished, full of control. "Let me explain something to you, mister." She paused, narrowing her eyes. "Whoever you are." Keanu didn't move. "You think you can sit there and act better than me just because you had a good moment?" She gave a small, cold smile. "You're just trying to cause a scene. Trying to get attention. For what? A viral video?" Someone across the aisle chuckled quietly. Margaret heard it, and it only made her angrier. You don't know me, she snapped. You don't know what I've done. Why no? What I stand for. I have donated money. I have helped people. I've been on boards for diversity and education. Don't you dare act like I'm a bad person just because of one little comment. And it wasn't even about you. Keanu kept watching her, still silent. His calm eyes made her more nervous than if he had shouted back. She leaned in closer, trying to break his stillness with her presence. People like you think you can walk into places you don't belong, she said. Dressed like that. Acting like you should be here. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Like what? He asked softly. Like you're not wearing a mask, she blurted. Her mouth opened, but no more words came out. She had been so sure a moment ago. But now her words felt weak, like glass, shiny but easy to break. Keanu leaned in slightly. His voice was quiet but strong. You keep asking if I belong here, he said. But maybe you're asking the wrong question. She stared at him. Maybe the real question is, he continued, if you need someone to look different, speak less, and agree with you to feel comfortable, then what exactly are you protecting in first class? Margaret flinched like she had been slapped. Her breath came faster, louder. The air felt thinner. But she wasn't ready to give up. She sat back, forced a cold smile, and pressed the call button above her seat again. Let's see how smug you are, she muttered, when someone with real power shows up. Keanu tilted his head just slightly. And waited. The soft chime of the call button rang through the first-class cabin like a warning bell. Margaret folded her arms, pretending she was calm. She kept her jaw tight as stone. She would not be ignored. Not today. Not by him. She stared straight ahead, waiting. No, summoning someone. Someone who would finally understand. Someone who would take her side. A few people sat up straighter. Passengers shifted in their seats. Phones tilted, recording discreetly. The low hum of conversation quieted to a hush. A moment later, the lead flight attendant arrived. Claire. She walked with a kind of grace that said she was used to handling trouble, both in the sky and among passengers. But as she reached their row and saw Keanu, her face changed. Recognition. Respect. She stopped beside them and gave Keanu a small, genuine nod. Mr. Reeves, she said softly. Welcome aboard. Margaret's mouth fell open slightly. Wait, she said, looking between them. You know him? Clara straightened. Everyone in our company knows Mr. Reeves, she said. He's the co-owner of this airline. Pause. Then a small, professional smile. And a valued guest. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was electric. Margaret's back went stiff. Her lips twitched into an uneasy smile. Oh, she said weakly. I didn't realize. Keanu said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of the moment had already shifted. Clara's voice remained professional, but there was something else underneath it now. A quiet steel hidden beneath her polite tone. Is there a problem with your seat, ma'am? Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. Her voice wouldn't come out. She could feel the moment slipping from her grasp. No, she said finally, forcing a small fake laugh. Just a miscommunication. Clara nodded. Understood. Then I trust there will be no further disruptions. She turned to Keanu. Let me know if there's anything you need, sir. All good, he said. His voice was calm. Clear. Clara walked away. And Margaret sat still. Too still. The murmur of the cabin returned, but it was different now. Less polite. Less forgiving. She could feel it, the change in the air. Not from the vents. From the people. The quiet weight of judgment. Subtle. Heavy. Real. A woman across the aisle slowly lowered her phone. A businessman 2 seats up smirked and shook his head as he returned to his tablet. Margaret's cheeks burned. She turned to Keanu. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You could have said something sooner. Keanu looked at her, soft but firm. You weren't asking. She looked away. Suddenly, the clouds outside the window seemed very interesting. And for the first time in a long time, Margaret Caldwell realized something that made her stomach twist. No one was coming to fix this for her. Not this time. She sat like stone as the sound of the plane surrounded her. Engines humming, newspapers rustling, ice clinking in glasses. But all she could hear was her own pulse. And the unbearable weight of everyone not looking at her. Not because they had moved on. Because they hadn't. They were pretending. Pretending not to care. Pretending not to judge. Pretending not to watch her out of the corner of their eyes, or through the tilted screens of their phones. But she could feel it. The tension. The quiet satisfaction. The stares that weren't obvious but weren't subtle either. A young woman across the aisle slowly lowered her phone. The look on her face said everything. Part shock, part smug thrill. Margaret's heart sank. She knew that look. It was the same look her teenage granddaughter wore when she found something juicy online. A smirk mixed with second-hand power. Margaret glanced at the woman's phone screen. A video thumbnail glowed in the dim cabin light. It was her. Blurry, slightly angled from a nearby seat, but unmistakably her. Standing stiff, voice sharp, eyes narrowed. Keanu sitting calmly beside her. The contrast was stark. And beneath the video, the caption read, "Racist woman tries to remove a man from first class. Doesn't realize who he is." Her breath caught. The view count was already past 40,000. Her phone buzzed. Once, twice, 3 times in quick succession. She reached for it. Her thumb trembled. Text after text lit up the screen. "Margaret, what did you do? Is this video real? Oh my God, tell me that's not you." Her stomach twisted. Her throat went dry. She turned her phone over and set it face down, as if that could erase what had already begun. Margaret stared straight ahead, her eyes wide open. She didn't blink. She didn't move. This wasn't going away. She was still on the plane, flying in the sky, but somehow, it felt like she had already crashed. She had wanted people to listen to her, but now, everyone was listening, for the wrong reason. And they weren't listening to her side of the story. They were listening to what the internet was saying about her, and she couldn't change it. She couldn't delete it. She couldn't fix it. She couldn't make people forget. For the first time ever, Margaret Caldwell wasn't in control. The world was, and the world wasn't being nice. She barely noticed when the captain spoke through the speakers, his voice calm like always. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Washington, D.C. Please make sure your seat backs are upright and your tray tables are stowed." Margaret heard the words, but they felt far away, like they didn't matter. Her hands, cold and shaking, reached for her seatbelt even though she had never taken it off. The air pressure inside the plane was changing, but something else was pressing on her too. Something heavy inside her chest, behind her ribs, behind her eyes. It wasn't something she could touch, but it felt unbearable. The video, her video, was spreading fast. It already had 100,000 views. She had refreshed the page. Once, twice. Then she stopped. The comments were worse than she ever imagined. People were making fun of her. People were calling her names. Hashtags with her name were popping up everywhere. Screenshots of her face, of her words, were being shared across the internet. Her name was trending. Not just Margaret. Not just Mrs. Caldwell. Her full name, Margaret Caldwell. It used to be a name connected to fancy parties, charity events, big meetings, and country clubs. Now it was a name in headlines. Now it was a warning. Now it was a joke. She had thought the worst part of the flight was the way the flight attendant had treated her so coldly. Or the way the passengers had clapped when they found out that Keanu Reeves wouldn't be moving seats just because she wanted him to. But no. This was worse. This was something else entirely. This was the end of everything she had spent her life building. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She felt completely exposed, like everyone could see right through her. Keanu hadn't spoken to her since the flight attendant returned. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any words. She could still hear it in her head. Over and over, like an echo, reminding her of what she now understood. She had done this to herself. And still, Keanu just sat there, calm, quiet, dignified, like nothing had happened. Like none of her words had touched him at all. That was what hurt the most. She had tried everything, all the little tricks she had learned over the years. The sharp words, the polite insults, the powerful voice she used when she wanted things to go her way. And none of it worked. She had no power here. She had no control. As the plane dropped lower and lower, heading toward the ground, the world outside became clearer. The buildings appeared through the clouds. The streets lined up in perfect rows. The runway stretched out beneath them. But inside the plane, Margaret's vision blurred. She could feel the people around her staring. Some were just watching. Some were judging. Some were enjoying her downfall. But none of them were on her side. No one asked if she was okay. No one cared if she was okay. Why would they? She felt her phone buzz in her purse. A message. A call. Another reminder of everything she was about to lose. She didn't look at it. She couldn't. The landing gear clunked into place. The lights shifted. The plane was almost on the ground, but Margaret had already fallen. This wasn't just a landing. This was a crash. And she wasn't going to walk away from it. The airport was loud. People talking. People rushing past. Suitcases rolling. Announcements over the speakers. But Margaret heard none of it. Because the moment the airplane door opened, the world attacked. A voice cut through the noise, sharp, eager, hungry. "Miss Caldwell, do you regret what you said on the flight?" Another voice shouted her name. Flash. The camera went off. Her feet stumbled on the jet bridge. She tried to walk faster. Head down. Sunglasses on. But it was too late. Her name was everywhere. Her face was everywhere. Frozen in a screenshot. Mid-sentence. Mid-anger. The internet's newest villain. Her phone buzzed. Again. This time, it was a call from the Marston Foundation board. She didn't answer. She already knew what they were going to say. Somewhere behind her, Keanu Reeves walked past. He stepped into a waiting car. Without a word. Still untouchable. Still calm. Still whole. Margaret? She stood there. On the curb. Alone. The world buzzing around her. No friends. No help. No way out. The city was alive, moving, full of people with somewhere to go. But Margaret had nowhere left to run. She had spent her whole life controlling the story. And now, the story was controlling her. She had wanted power. She had wanted respect. But now all she had was silence. And the silence was deafening. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.